Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. Let's get started. Of course, these classes are available to be sponsored. If you'd like to sponsor a class, please let us know. Put it in the comments, send us a message. Helps us continue doing these classes. Okay, let's get started. This week's Torah portion is Parsha Va'era. We left off last week and we talked a little bit about the same topic we're going to talk about today. We're going to be talking about Moses' conversation with God, and that's kind of the end of last week's Parsha. We're getting this week's Torah portion where Moses confronts God. Moses says to God, and we'll read it inside in Exodus chapter 5, verse 20. Moses says as follows. And Moses, the people met Moses and Aaron standing before them as they were leaving the Pharaoh. So they go to Pharaoh and they say, "Hey, let my people go." And Pharaoh says, "Not a chance." And people said to him, "Let God look upon you and judge. You have made our presence a horror in the eyes of the Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants, placing a sword in their hands to kill us." Right? So Pharaoh says, not only he's not going to let people go, he's going to make their misery worse. He's going to make them work harder. And Moses returns to God and he says, "My master, why have you harmed this people? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done more harm to this people, and you have not rescued your people." So Moses says, ever since I've started talking to you, God, things have gotten worse. And God says to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. By strong hand he will let them go. By strong hand he will drive them out of his land." And then in this week's Torah portion, God says to Pharaoh as follows. And God spoke to Moses and he said, "I am God. I have previously appeared. You're not the first person I've talked to. I've appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the name of Kel Shaddai, Shem Dal Yod, but my name, the Lord, meaning the Tetragrammaton, Yud Kei Vav Kei, I have not made known to them." So God's saying, listen, I've talked to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I've never had this problem before. And in fact, Rashi says that we talked about a little bit last week that Abraham God was saying that I talked to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he never criticized me, and but now you are. So, and last week we talked about it in the context that Moses we talked about it in the context that looked at it like a negative. But in this week we're going to talk a little bit differently about why did Moses actually say that? Why did he say to God, "Yeah, I didn't criticize God"? Why did he do that? Moses was a pretty smart guy. Moses is the giver of the Torah. He is the one who is considered, the ultimate divine wisdom is passed through him. Moses is a smart guy. So why would Moses do that? So let's look at this dichotomy of these two different things. So let's continue discussing this. So when we look at what Moses does, he's not questioning God as he wasn't questioning God like, "What are you doing? You don't know what you're doing," or he doesn't say to God, "I don't believe in God anymore." That's not what Moses does. What does Moses do? Moses goes and he kind of cries out to God. He says to God, "How can you do this?" Not in a questioning way, but as an impassioned cry, something that Moses is in pain, the Jewish people are in pain, and Moses responds to that. So now the same God that tells us, that the answer, which is that God is going to take care of it, he's going to take care of it, this situation, God records it in the Torah for prosperity. This question of Moses of why have you harmed this people? And that we have seemingly, if the Torah is a book of law, not just a book of laws, but a book of lessons for every single one of us. So obviously there must be some truth to this idea that what Moses is saying, that he's crying out and not just saying, "Well, God must know what he's doing." That's not what Moses says. Moses cries out. So let's see we're going to look at another time that that Jewish sages kind of question God in this way of crying out to God. The Talmud in Tractate Yoma, page 69b, says as follows. There, in the prayer services, we call God, and this based on Moses' prayer in Deuteronomy, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora, the great, the mighty, the awesome God. Okay, so we have a tradition from Moses that when you pray to God, you call him the great, the mighty, the awesome God. So, what's the problem? So the Talmud says, why are the men of the Great Assembly called the men of the Great Assembly? Because they restored this, they restored this prayer. The idea that when we call out to God, we say, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God. So what happened? So the Talmud goes through the story. Jeremiah said, the forces of Nebuchadnezzar are reveling in his sanctuary, right? And Nebuchadnezzar was hanging out in the sanctuary, in the temple, in Jerusalem. So Jeremiah said, where is his greatness? I'm sorry, where is his awesomeness? How can you say someone's awesome? There's somebody else in your house. And therefore, in Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 18, he says, the great God, the mighty Lord of hosts is his name. He does not say the awesome one. So we see here that Jeremiah basically questions God. He said, how could God be awesome if there are foreigners, invaders in his temple? Then we have the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, the Talmud again records, he says, Gentiles are enslaving his children. Where is his might? Therefore, he did not say mighty in his prayer. And again, in Daniel chapter 9, verse 4, he says, the great and awesome God. He does not say mighty, and he doesn't say, following the tradition of Jeremiah, he does not say awesome. So, the members of the Great Assembly said, on the contrary, this itself is the might of his might in the fullest expression, that he conquers his inclination and shows patience toward the wicked. God's anger is aroused by the Gentile nations enslaving his people, yet he displays immense might by restraining his anger and refraining from punishing them immediately. Therefore, it is still fitting to call him mighty. These acts also express his awesomeness. For not for the awesomeness of God, how could one people, the Jewish people alone, and despised among the nations, survive among them? So the rabbis of the Great Assembly, they said on the contrary, these things are exactly show God's greatness and God's awesomeness. His might and his awesomeness. And therefore they reinstituted the prayer, and until this day, that is how the Jewish people pray, right? We say the great, the mighty, the awesome, etc. So we see that this kind of contradiction. On the one hand, you have great prophets, Jeremiah and Daniel, that take essentially go away from tradition and kind of question God. How can you say God is mighty? How can you say God is awesome? That's crazy. What do you mean? These are not theologians. Some are prophets, people who saw God, and yet they're questioning God's awesomeness and his might. So the Talmud explains as follows. Rabbi Elazar said, they did so because they knew God to be truthful, and they did not want to speak falsely about him. Essentially, that they had to see God through the way they saw things. And they saw, at this moment, we don't see God's might, we don't see God's awesomeness. Later, the rabbis explained that yes, that we really do see God's might, we really do see God's awesomeness, even though that it seemed like it wasn't. So, but at that time, they were in pain, and we see how they just said what they thought. They said, I don't see it. I don't see it, just like Moses. In a way, they're actually following Moses. Right? Moses said, how can you do harm to this people? Moses called balls and strikes. He didn't say, I'm sure God knows what he's doing. Jeremiah didn't say, I'm sure God knows what he's doing. And Daniel didn't just say, I'm sure God knows what he's doing, that Jewish people are enslaved. No, they cried out. And they changed the liturgy of the prayer in reflection of that. So there's this idea that that looking at these two dichotomies, that there's a question, at the same time there's still faith in God. There's an idea that in Talmudic literature that there are things that cannot be questioned, and there are things that are up for debate. So, for example, there's a debate in the Talmud. I'm not going to go through the entire debate, but in Yevamos page 76b, there's a debate between Rabbi Shimon and his colleagues. And they say as follows. Rabbi Shimon's colleagues said to him, if you are reporting a legal ruling you receive from your teachers, we will accept it from you. So in other words, if you're saying that this is the law, this is the way it's always been, and this is what your teachers taught you, we accept. We know that you're not lying, you're not making stuff up. However, but if you are merely trying to prove your case through reasoning based on your own logic, there is a refutation of your argument. So this idea that sometimes we view things that, okay, if this is, we kind of say, sometimes we say to God, okay, if that's what it is, it is. But you should know, if there's a chance that we could fix this, we're not agreeing to it. In other words, when painful things happen to the Jewish people, Jewish leaders have two ways of dealing with it. You could either say, this is, God knows what He's doing, and I know for sure He knows what He's doing. Everything must be good. I'm not worried about it. The second way is, yes, God knows what He's doing. Everything, He knows exactly what He's doing. He's doing it for a reason. However, it pains me right now. And as a leader of the Jewish people, a leader of the flock, that Jewish leader sometimes is going to say, God, we're in pain. Do you understand? Like, yes, we'll accept it. If that's the way it has to be, we'll accept it. But if we don't have, if we're not obligated to accept it, we don't. Why should we accept it? Why should we accept pain for in our realm? Yes, maybe in your realm this is all good, but in our realm, in our reality, this is painful, and we're going to react to that. And this is actually the correct answer to Jewish suffering and to Jewish pain. Is that yes, we know that God is doing exactly what He wants to do, what He needs to do. However, the Jewish response is not, it's okay. The Jewish response is, no, we're in pain. And now let's look at God's response to Moses. Moses questions God and says, why have you done harm to this people? And God responds, I've talked to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob before. So what is that answer? What is the answer to that question? So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they are our forefathers, and they transmitted to the Jewish people their mode of service of God, which was not in a way of exile, but in a way that we don't really see what's going on, but era. And I have appeared, I have seen, I've showed myself to our forefathers, that they are, by us having faith that our forefathers have this connection to God and they passed it on to us. That is how we get through it. So in other words, it's not based on well, I don't understand. Yeah, that's not the point. It's an inheritance. This is your heritage. This is who you are, your DNA. Your DNA is that you're a Jew who believes in God because Abraham believed in God, because Isaac believed in God, because Jacob believed in God. And so every single Jew has this ability to tap in to this idea that every single one of us are able to recognize and have faith in God. In other words, the way we get through it is by recognizing, so we're in pain, God's doing something, we don't like it, and the answer is that we continue to go on knowing that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they had a connection to God, and that they gave us this connection to God, and that we know that there is a service of God of connection that is an open connection to God, and when we're connected to that, that's how we get through it. And they in other words, I guess the best way of saying it is that the Jewish people, yes, we're in exile and we have pain and tragedy and suffering, but we should know that the truth is that every single one of us has a way of knowing that we never really went to exile. We're kind of living in the way of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where there is no exile, where there is no suffering, where everything is good. That there is that soul level that we're connected to. So in other words, we get through it by knowing that yes, God is taking care of us. That's how we get through it. And it's interesting, and the Rebbe points this out in a talk that the name of the Torah portion is called Va'era, which means and I appeared. That even though the words of the beginning of the Torah portion are called the first words actually are not even Va'era, it's Vayidaber, and God spoke to Moses, which obviously usually Torah portions don't start with that, but that's a whole different conversation. We don't call a name of Vayidaber. We would have a lot of Vayidabers, but it's called Va'era, and it doesn't say Va'era el Avraham, and I showed myself to Abraham, which, if you think about it, really, that's the context. The context is that God is telling Moses, I showed myself to Abraham. Seemingly, that should be the name of the Torah portion. Not just Va'era and I appeared. It's Va'era el ha'avos, that I showed myself to the forefathers. So that should be the name of the Torah portion. But no, all the Jewish people throughout the millennia have called the Torah portion Va'era. They have called it, I shouldn't say millennia, but yeah, definitely for the last 1,000+ years, we call it Va'era, which means, and I have shown myself, which we're basically saying is that yes, technically God showed himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but really through that he showed himself to every single one of us. And through that, through knowing that God actually has shown himself to us, that if we could tap into that, that's how we get through it. We know that God has shown himself to us, that we have a deep connection to the God, that we have a connection to God that's beyond the exile, beyond the tragedy that we're experiencing. And that is how we get through it. And that is how we keep going further, even though that the exile is difficult and it is painful. And we're not denying that. We're not accepting that. It's not our job to accept God's what God has done to the Jewish people or allowed to happen to the Jewish people. But it's our job to keep going forward. How do we do that? By knowing that God has a connection to us, a deep connection, a seeing connection, not just a hearing, not just something that, third hand, but we have each and every one of us. Through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we all have a connection to God. Thank you very much for joining us, and God willing, we will see you next week. Have a great Shabbos.